We've had solutions around the ridiculously expensive GameCube component cables for a while now, thanks to things like GC Video. Well, now Retrobit has a brand new set of cables out, so let's see how they stack up. In this video, I aim to look at 3 options to play GameCube games on modern televisions and how they stack up to each other. This is not meant to be definitive. I don't have all the solutions, like the GH HD Mark II, and I don't have the original cables from Nintendo. They're outrageously expensive. So I'm going to look at the Wii using HD Retrovision cables and the Prism cables from Retrobit with my GameCube. Both of those will be captured through the RetroTink 5X for ease and clarity. As a control, I'll be using the Carby Direct HDMI 480p, scaled in OBS of course. But first, let's check out the Prism cables on their own. The cables themselves have a nice build to them. In fact, if you've been using any modern cables, be it SCART, Component, or S-Video, the thickness of the cable until it splits at the end will look and feel very familiar, especially if you've been living that HD Retrovision life. I'm not going to cut them open and check internal shielding or anything, but I don't feel like they skimped anywhere. Or at least, I hope the nice external build reflects the internal one. The end plug is way bigger than I expected it to be. The Carby certainly isn't a skinny boy, but extends out rather than being as wide, and that little bit of extra heft made a big difference for my GameCube. I have a Regent switch mod from forever ago, and the plug hits the physical switch for it. Something to be aware of if you have any mods sitting next to the digital port, but obviously I'm in a unique position. Now for those that don't know, these are not compatible with the Wii. The GameCube uses a different set of cables for component out. It was always one of the issues that kept us from having third-party cables in the first place. The GameCube uses a special digital out, and the cables have a specific chipset to process that signal. Which also means these don't work with later models of GameCubes, only the 001 models, even though the regular port is still the same as the Super Nintendo, which has component out from it. This mostly only applies to the NTSC systems, and I'll link in the video description to an article for a bit more detail. When I first tried the cables from Retrobit, I was honestly very impressed and have continued to be so, using them to stream Star Fox adventures. Thrown into the RetroTink 5X Pro and then into my TV from 2011 and into OBS itself, the picture is vibrant, sharp, steady, and I certainly couldn't think of any complaints. In motion and concentrating on the game, everything looks as it should. I didn't see any weird artifacting or off colors. Of course, these cables shine the most when you're in 480p. Especially if you're going to be plugging them into your flat panel or into a scaler. So make sure you hold B when booting a game that supports progressive scan so the prompt shows up. Sometimes the GameCube will ask if you want progressive scan without holding B, but sometimes it just won't. I tend to not get the prompt when using a Carby, for example. Thankfully, Retrobit put their own reminder in the box. A CRT will be a completely different story, obviously. And depending on your preference and the television, you may not even really feel like you need component. Super Mario Sunshine, in my opinion, is probably one of the best baselines to set when testing something like this for the GameCube. There's a lot of color, it's heavy on the lighting and shadow, and you have effects like the tropical heat, and of course, all the water from flood. I think things here look lovely with the Retrobit cables. There's a good contrast in the lighting, colors are clean, and again, I didn't see any glaring artifacts. It isn't emulation sharp or anything, Dolphin does some amazing things, but for an accurate and clean from original hardware picture, the quality is looking good here. The Carby only does native 480p, there's no scaling, and since it's HDMI, you can't really put it through most scalers. So depending on your TV or monitor, it will likely soft scale it to fill the screen, which is what I tried to replicate a bit in OBS. No fancy filters or scaling, just a clean 480p signal bumped up to fill the space. Honestly, I never have any issues with the Carby outside of it being a bit soft on both my TVs, but it still was certainly fine for me. Now the Wii historically has a similar issue when compared to the original signal from the GameCube, with some softer edges and muted colors, though I personally find them minor if I ever notice them at all. With HD Retrovision cables, I was never even sure I saw any difference at all between the two. The image quality is very clean. But there was something surprising when I started putting these side by side to prep for this video. The Prism is actually the darkest of the 3. What I said about the softness of the 480p versus the full scaled image through the RetroTink 5X still stands, but there is a significant difference in brightness and contrast when side by side. This is not necessarily bad, just something that will leave it up to you on which you would prefer. I will say that I feel like OBS and my capture card show this more than my TV actually does, which is what makes it as surprising as it is. It is why I said Super Mario Sunshine is a good benchmark for things like this. All that color, contrast, lighting, it shows these things off good or bad very well. More muted games are something where you are rarely standing still, just won't be as obvious. Something dark will likely just be a little darker and not much else, so it may not be apparent either without a frame of reference. It's important to clarify sometimes these things are made worse by capture equipment and video compression. But once I was aware of it, and I paid a little more attention, there was a definite loss of contrast with the prism cables, and it isn't something I've noticed when using the HD Retrovision cables or the carbine. But the important part is that in regular use, these look fine, and you can always adjust these settings in OBS or on your TV to compensate for this loss. Because of this, I also wanted to see when compared to the carbine how these looked without the middleman of the RetroTink 5X upscaling the image. I threw them into a component to HDMI converter, and this was the image I got. There's still the same difference. As you can see though, it does stretch the image and artifacting is way up. That's a common problem with these cheap component converters. There are okay ones out there, but this obviously isn't one of them. This is just 480p and soft scale on your TV, just like the carbine. But if the converter is good and doesn't add lag, it can be a fine choice. Those are big asterisks though. Honestly, in this type of situation, I would just stick with buying a carbine. So with all this said, I honestly would say this about the cables from Retrobit. These are wonderful cables, but if you just want to play your GameCube games on your flat panel and you're not worried about sending your TV a 480i or 480p signal, the carbine is perfectly fine. If you're using a CRT, you may not even need component S-Video, or a composite may suit you just fine. Plus, there is the Wii. With good cables, the Wii still shines as a great way to play GameCube games, in my opinion, and you have all the choices. But of course, there is the Game Boy player, which is, in my opinion, the real reason to worry about these solutions with your original GameCube. So for this video, that leaves us with the carbine or RetroBits cables for this GameCube to play Game Boy games. Well, technically S-Video, since the RetroTink 5X takes an S-Video, but I'm not going to worry about that or using Swiss enforcing different resolutions and software. Let's just go stock and just kind of see how it looks. Obviously, again, the carbine will be softer here, as it's not being upscaled by something else. Just that raw signal pushed through HDMI and then soft scaled to fill the screen. That touch of darkness is there again as well from the Retrobit cables, but it isn't a strong issue. I again don't think there is a wrong choice here, especially when not using Swiss. It is just going to be your preference and what works with your setup. So in conclusion, the cables from Retrobit are very nice, and I'm happy to have quality component cables that I can plug into my RetroTink and scale my games, both GameCube and Game Boy, with all the bells and whistles that comes with that kind of setup. Taking a 480p game and scaling it to 1080p looks sharp and colorful. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using a Wii or just going with the carbine. In the end, think about the chain of your setup and what will fit best and where you want to spend your dollars. But we should all be thankful that more solutions are being made for the GameCube, a wonderful system that needs more love, in my opinion. Well, that's all from me in this episode of RetroActive. Let me know what your current preference is in playing GameCube games, or if you'll be picking up the Prism cables from Retrobit. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Hey, this is Kevin. Once again, thanking you so much for watching another episode of RetroActive. If you liked it, please hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, all the stuff I'm supposed to say. And I also want to remind you that I do have a Ko-fi account and a Discord. Links will be in the description. Bye.